My son asked me to leave the house I built with my own hands because his wife needed more space. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply handed him the property papers and walked out the door. 7 days later, they stood on my doorstep begging to come back, but when I opened that door and they saw what was inside, everything changed. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Margaret Eleanor Thompson, and I just turned 68 years old last month. I know what you're thinking when you see me. Just another elderly woman with gray hair, wrinkled hands, and a quiet voice. But behind these tired eyes is a story of strength, sacrifice, and a love so deep it nearly destroyed me. For the past 40 years, I poured every ounce of my being into building a life for my family, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, dream by dream. I'm a widow. My husband James passed away 28 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving me alone with our 12-year-old son, Daniel. I remember that devastating morning like it was yesterday. One moment James was laughing at breakfast, and the next he was gone. I was 39 years old, scared, broke, and responsible for a grieving child who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I had no college degree, no career, and no safety net. But I had something stronger than all of that. I had determination. I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. During the day, I was a seamstress at a local alterations shop, hunched over a sewing machine for 8 hours, fixing hems and mending tears in other people's clothes, while my own were falling apart. At night, I cleaned classrooms at the elementary school Daniel attended. I'd scrub floors on my hands and knees, empty trash bins, and wipe down chalkboards while other mothers were home tucking their children into bed. I survived on 4 hours of sleep and endless cups of black coffee because I couldn't afford cream and sugar. Every single penny I earned went into 2 things: Daniel's future and our home. I saved for 5 years to put a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood with good schools. That house became my pride and joy. I painted every wall myself. I planted every flower in the garden. I fixed leaky faucets and patched roof shingles because I couldn't afford to hire help. That house represented everything I'd sacrificed and everything I'd overcome. It was proof that a widow with nothing could still build something beautiful. People in our neighborhood knew me as the kind soul who always had fresh-baked cookies for the local kids and who volunteered at the community center every Sunday, serving meals to families struggling just like I once did. I never remarried, never even dated. My entire world revolved around one singular dream: seeing my son Daniel happy, educated, and settled. I put him through college by taking on extra sewing projects and cleaning jobs. I went without new clothes, vacations, or luxuries so he could have textbooks, a laptop, and a future I never had. Daniel was my everything, my reason for waking up every morning, my purpose, my joy. I believed with every fiber of my being that family meant everything, that the bond between mother and child was unbreakable, that love and sacrifice would always be appreciated and returned. I never imagined that the very person I gave my entire life to would one day look me in the eyes and tell me I was no longer wanted in the home I built. Life before everything fell apart was simple, peaceful, and filled with the kind of quiet joy that comes from routine and purpose. I had finally reached a place where I could breathe, where the struggles of the past felt like distant memories, and where every day felt like a small reward for all those years of hardship. My mornings began the same way they had for decades. The alarm clock would ring at 6 in the morning, and I'd wake up without complaint, grateful for another day. The first thing I'd do was shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers and start the coffee maker. The rich aroma of fresh coffee would fill the house, mixing with the scent of whatever I was baking that week. Sometimes it was cinnamon rolls, other times blueberry muffins or banana bread. I loved baking. It was my therapy, my way of showing love when words felt inadequate. By the time Daniel and Jessica came downstairs, the kitchen table would be set with fresh coffee, scrambled eggs made fluffy the way Daniel had loved, since he was 7 years old, buttered toast, and whatever pastry I'd prepared. Daniel had gotten married to Jessica 4 years ago, and they'd moved into my house 2 years after the wedding. At first, I was thrilled. Having my son under the same roof again felt like a blessing. The house that had felt too big and too quiet after James died was suddenly alive with voices and footsteps. I had family again. I had purpose again. Jessica was polite in the beginning, always thanking me for meals and complimenting my cooking. I tried my best to make her feel welcome, to give them space, to be helpful without being intrusive. My days followed a comfortable rhythm. After breakfast, I'd clean up the kitchen while Daniel and Jessica left for work. Then I'd spend my mornings tending to my garden in the backyard. That garden was my sanctuary. I grew tomatoes that turned deep red in the summer sun, roses in every shade of pink and red, and herbs like basil, rosemary, and thyme that I'd use in my cooking. I talked to my plants the way some people talk to pets, telling them about my day, about Daniel, about little memories of James. The garden never judged, never complained, and always grew beautifully under my care. In the afternoons, I'd run errands, visit the local market, or sometimes babysit for neighbors who knew they could trust me with their children. I'd built a reputation over the years as the reliable, grandmother figure everyone could count on. On Wednesdays, I volunteered at the community center, helping organize donated clothes and serving lunch to families in need. It reminded me of where I'd been and made me grateful for where I was. Evenings were my favorite time. Daniel, Jessica, and I would gather around the old wooden dining table that James had built with his own hands 40 years ago. The table was scratched and worn, but I refused to replace it. It held too many memories, too many birthday cakes, homework sessions, and family conversations. I'd serve dinner, usually pot roast or chicken casserole or spaghetti, and I'd ask about their day. Daniel would tell me stories about his job at the marketing firm, making me laugh with impressions of his demanding boss. Jessica would scroll through her phone occasionally, offering short responses when I tried to engage her in conversation. My bedroom was small, tucked at the end of the hallway, but it was filled with everything that mattered to me. Photo albums lined the shelves, chronicling Daniel's entire life from his first breath to his wedding day. I had his baby shoes bronzed and displayed on my dresser. I had James's reading glasses in a small box that I'd open sometimes just to feel close to him again. My quilt, hand-stitched by my own mother, covered my bed. Every corner of that room told a story of love, loss, and survival. I felt content during those days. I had my routines, my little joys, my sense of purpose. I believed I was exactly where I was supposed to be, surrounded by family in the home I'd worked so hard to build. The future seemed predictable and safe. I had no reason to suspect that the peace I'd finally found was about to be shattered in ways I never could have imagined. It started so subtly that I almost missed it. Looking back now, I realized the signs were there for weeks, maybe even months, but I was too trusting, too comfortable in my routine to notice the shift happening right under my nose. The first real moment that made my stomach tighten with unease happened on a Thursday evening in late September. I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry, when I passed Daniel and Jessica's bedroom. Their door was closed, which wasn't unusual, but I could hear voices inside. Low voices. The kind of hushed tones people use when they don't want to be overheard. I slowed my steps without meaning to, and that's when I heard my name. Margaret. Jessica said it with a tone I'd never heard her use before. It wasn't warm or affectionate. It was sharp, almost irritated, laced with something that made my chest feel tight. I couldn't make out full sentences, just fragments. Daniel's voice responded, quieter, almost pleading. I stood there in the hallway, frozen, my heart beating faster than it should. Part of me wanted to knock on the door and ask if everything was all right. Part of me wanted to press my ear against the wood and hear exactly what they were saying about me. But I did neither. Instead, I continued walking to the kitchen, setting the laundry basket down with trembling hands. I told myself I was overreacting. Couples talk. Couples have private conversations. It didn't mean anything. but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. It settled into my bones like a cold draft you can't quite locate. That night at dinner, I noticed Daniel wouldn't look at me. Not really. When I asked him how his day was, he gave short, clipped answers while pushing green beans around his plate. "Fine, Mom, just busy." He used to tell me everything, every detail, every frustration and triumph. Now I got one-word responses and awkward silences. Jessica was different too. When I greeted her the next morning with my usual cheerful, "Good morning, sweetheart," she barely glanced up from her phone. Her fingers moved rapidly across the screen, her face expressionless. "Morning," she muttered, not even attempting a smile. The Jessica I'd first met would have complimented the fresh muffins cooling on the counter. This Jessica acted like I was invisible, like the breakfast I'd prepared was something she was entitled to, rather than something made with love. Over the next few days, I started noticing other small things. The way they'd stop talking when I entered a room. The way Jessica would give Daniel meaningful looks across the table that I couldn't interpret. The way my son had stopped sitting in the chair next to me during dinner, choosing instead to sit across from me, putting more physical distance between us. These were tiny shifts, barely perceptible, but they accumulated like snowflakes before an avalanche. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found them both on the couch, heads close together, looking at Jessica's laptop. The moment they heard my footsteps, Jessica snapped the laptop shut with a speed that felt guilty. "Just work stuff," she said quickly, too quickly, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel nodded, not meeting my gaze. I smiled back and said something about starting dinner, but inside, alarm bells were ringing softly. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, James's reading glasses clutched in my hand like a talisman. I tried to organize my thoughts, to make sense of the strange atmosphere that had invaded my peaceful home. Something was wrong. Something had shifted in the way my son and his wife looked at me, spoke to me, existed around me. It felt like I'd become an inconvenience in my own house, a problem they were discussing in whispered conversations behind closed doors. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress does strange things to people. Maybe they were having marriage problems. Maybe Jessica was unhappy at work. Maybe Daniel was worried about money. It probably had nothing to do with me at all. But deep down, in that place where mothers always know when something is wrong with their children, I felt the first flutter of real fear. Something was coming. I just didn't know what yet. I refused to believe what my gut was telling me. Every instinct I had as a mother screamed that something was terribly wrong. But I pushed those thoughts away like unwanted guests at my door. I'd spent nearly 3 decades raising Daniel alone, and I knew my son. He was good. He was kind. He would never intentionally hurt me. Whatever tension I was sensing had to be temporary, a rough patch that every family goes through. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that my loneliness and age were making me see problems where none existed. When Jessica walked past me in the hallway without acknowledging my greeting, I told myself she must not have heard me. Maybe she had earbuds in. Maybe she was deep in thought about something important at work. When Daniel came home and went straight to his bedroom without our usual chat about his day, I reasoned that he must be exhausted. His job was demanding. He needed space to decompress. It wasn't personal. It couldn't be personal. I started making excuses for everything. The hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. They were probably planning a surprise for me. My birthday was months away, but maybe they were getting an early start. The way they exchanged glances at dinner, that's just what married couples do. They have their own private language, their own inside jokes. I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into normal behavior. To prove to myself that everything was fine, I decided to be even more helpful, even more present, even more valuable to their lives. If I could just show them how much I contributed to this household, any doubts they might have about living together would disappear. I threw myself into being the perfect mother and mother-in-law with an almost desperate energy. I woke up earlier to make more elaborate breakfasts. Instead of simple scrambled eggs, I made omelets with cheese and vegetables, fresh squeezed orange juice, and homemade cinnamon rolls that took hours to prepare. I deep cleaned the entire house, scrubbing baseboards and washing windows until they sparkled. I did all of their laundry without being asked, folding every shirt perfectly and organizing their closet by color. I bought Jessica's favorite flowers, bright yellow sunflowers, and arranged them in a vase on the kitchen counter with a cheerful note that read, "Just because you brighten our home." I volunteered to run all their errands. Need groceries? I'll go. Need to pick up dry cleaning? I'll handle it. Need the car washed? Consider it done. I wanted to be indispensable. I wanted them to see me as an asset rather than whatever negative thing I feared they might be thinking. I cooked their favorite meals every single night. Pot roast for Daniel on Monday, chicken parmesan for Jessica on Tuesday. I baked cookies and left them on the counter in case they wanted a snack. But with each gesture, each effort, each attempt to prove my worth, I noticed the distance growing rather than shrinking. My elaborate breakfasts were met with distracted thank yous and plates left half-eaten. The flowers I bought went unmentioned. The note I wrote was crumpled in the trash the next day, which I discovered when I was taking out the garbage. That discovery hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I told myself Jessica probably just threw it away by accident. At night, lying in my small bedroom surrounded by photographs of happier times, I'd have conversations with myself, with James's memory, trying to rationalize everything. "You're overthinking this, Margaret," I'd whisper into the darkness. "Daniel loves you. You raised him right. He would never turn on you. You're his mother. That bond is unbreakable." I thought back to all the years I'd sacrificed for him, the times I went hungry so he could have seconds, the times I wore the same worn coat for 5 winters so he could have new school clothes, the times I worked double shifts so he could go on field trips with his classmates. Surely all of that meant something. Surely love like that couldn't just evaporate. I was his mother. I had earned my place in this home, in his life, in his heart. So I continued smiling through the awkward dinners. I continued pretending not to notice when they'd suddenly stop talking as I approached. I continued acting like everything was perfectly normal because admitting the truth, admitting that my own son might be pulling away from me, was simply too painful to face. Denial became my armor, protecting me from a reality I wasn't ready to accept. The moment that shattered my denial came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the autumn sunlight filtered through the living room windows in golden streams. Daniel and Jessica were both at work, and I was doing what I did every Tuesday, cleaning the house from top to bottom. I had my routine down to a science: dust the shelves, vacuum the carpets, wipe down surfaces, and make everything perfect for when they came home. I was in the living room, dusting the bookshelf near the window when I noticed something on the coffee table that made me pause. It was a manila folder left partially open, with papers spilling out slightly. Normally, I wouldn't have looked. I respected their privacy. But something about the way it sat there, carelessly abandoned, drew my attention. The top page had words printed in large letters that I could read even from a distance. Senior Living Communities. My heart skipped a beat. My hands, still holding the dust cloth, began to tremble. I told myself to walk away, to mind my own business, to keep cleaning and forget I'd seen anything. But my feet carried me toward that coffee table as if pulled by an invisible string. I set down my dust cloth and picked up the folder with shaking fingers. Inside was a glossy brochure for a place called Golden Years Assisted Living. The cover showed elderly people smiling in a garden, playing cards, doing watercolor, paintings. It looked pleasant enough, but the sight of it made my stomach turn to ice. I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring slightly as my eyes struggled to focus. There were floor plans for studio apartments and one-bedroom units. There were descriptions of activities, meal plans, and medical services available on site. But what made my blood run completely cold were the handwritten notes in the margins. Jessica's handwriting. I recognized her neat, precise script immediately. Next to one facility, she'd written affordable and circled the monthly cost of $2,800. Next to another, she'd written good reviews, takes Medicaid. There were check marks next to certain amenities and question marks next to others, like she was comparing options, doing research, making plans. Underneath the brochures was a printed article from a website. The title read, How to Talk to Aging Parents About Moving Out, a compassionate guide for adult children. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. My lungs couldn't seem to pull in enough air. I sank onto the couch, the papers clutched in my trembling hands, and read through the article with growing horror. It offered advice on how to approach elderly parents about transitioning to assisted living, how to frame it as being in their best interest, how to handle resistance and guilt. There were passages highlighted in yellow marker. Emphasize independence and community. Focus on safety concerns. Discuss the burden of home maintenance. Each highlighted section felt like a knife twisting in my gut. This wasn't casual browsing. This wasn't a what-if conversation. This was a strategy. This was a plan to convince me, to manipulate me, to move me out of my own home. I sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. Why would they research this without talking to me first? I'm only 68. I'm healthy. I walk 3 miles every week. I cook, clean, garden, volunteer. I don't need assisted living. I don't need help with daily tasks. I'm not a burden. Or am I? Is that how they see me? As an aging parent who needs to be managed, relocated, removed? My hands shook as I carefully placed everything back exactly as I'd found it. I didn't want them to know I'd seen it. Not yet. I needed time to think, to process, to understand what was really happening. I picked up my dust cloth with numb fingers and continued cleaning, but my mind was spinning in circles. Every doubt I'd been pushing away came flooding back with undeniable clarity. The whispered conversations weren't about surprises. The cold shoulders weren't about stress. The distance wasn't temporary. This was real. This was happening. My son and his wife were planning to move me out of the house I built, and they were doing it behind my back, researching facilities and strategies like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I finished cleaning that day on autopilot, my body going through familiar motions while my heart cracked into pieces. The evidence was small, just some brochures and an article, but it was undeniable. My worst fears weren't paranoia. They were preparation for a conversation I now knew was coming. 3 days after finding the brochure, the conversation I'd been dreading finally happened. It was a Saturday evening, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Daniel appeared in the doorway with Jessica standing just behind him. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. This was it, the moment of truth. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" His voice was careful, rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror. My hand stilled on the cutting board where I'd been chopping vegetables. My heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, setting down the knife and wiping my hands on my apron. I followed them into the living room where they sat together on the couch. I took the armchair across from them, my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. Daniel couldn't look me in the eye. He stared at the coffee table, at his hands, at the wall behind me, anywhere but directly at my face. Jessica sat with her arms crossed, her expression neutral but her jaw set with determination. It was clear who had orchestrated this conversation. "Mom, Jessica and I have been talking," Daniel began, his voice wavering slightly. "We've been thinking about our future, about starting a family, and we feel like we need more space. The house feels crowded with 3 people, and we think it would be better for everyone if you found your own place." The words hung in the air like poison. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say he was joking, to tell me this was some kind of cruel prank, but his face remained serious, troubled, guilty. "Your own place," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. My throat felt tight, like someone was squeezing it. Daniel, this is my house. This is the house your father and I saved for years to buy. This is the house I've lived in for over 30 years. Jessica leaned forward, and I saw the calculation in her eyes. Actually, Margaret, Daniel's name is on the deed, too. Remember? You added him as a co-owner 5 years ago. So technically, it's his house as much as it is yours. We're not kicking you out. We're just saying that maybe it's time for you to think about downsizing. You're getting older, and wouldn't a smaller place be easier for you to manage? You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work. Some of these senior communities are really nice. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair so hard my knuckles turned white. I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for any sign of the boy I'd raised. I added your name to the deed because you're my son, I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay calm. I added your name because I wanted you to inherit this house someday, to have security, to know you'd always have a home. I never thought you'd use it against me. Daniel finally met my eyes, and I saw guilt there, but not enough to stop him. Mom, please try to understand. We need to think about our future. And I don't have a future? The words came out sharper than I intended. I'm 68, Daniel, not 98. I'm healthy. I take care of this house. I take care of you both. When did I become such a burden? That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the conversation over and over like a terrible movie stuck on repeat. Something about the whole interaction felt wrong, calculated, rehearsed. Jessica's quick responses, the way she had all the facts ready about the deed and co-ownership, Daniel's inability to look me in the eye. This wasn't a spontaneous discussion about needing space. This was a planned attack, and I'd walked right into it unprepared. As dawn broke through my curtains, I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about space. It couldn't be. Our house had 3 bedrooms. Even with a baby, there would be plenty of room. People raised multiple children in smaller homes than this. No, there was something else driving this sudden urgency to remove me, and I needed to know what it was. The next morning, after Daniel and Jessica left for work, I did something I'd never done before. I went into Daniel's home office, the small room at the end of the hall that he'd claimed as his workspace. My heart pounded with guilt and fear as I crossed the threshold. I wasn't a snooping mother. I'd always respected his privacy. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The desk was neat and organized, just like Daniel had always been. I started looking through papers, not sure what I was searching for, but trusting my instincts. Bills, work documents, nothing unusual. Then I noticed a drawer that wasn't fully closed. I pulled it open and found a folder labeled Property Documents. Inside was a property appraisal for my house dated just 3 weeks ago. The estimated value was listed as $680,000. My hands trembled as I read the details. $680,000. I bought this house for $89,000 33 years ago. I knew property values had increased, but seeing that number in print was staggering. Beneath the appraisal were mortgage pre-approval letters addressed to Daniel and Jessica Martinez. But these weren't for my house. These were for a different property, an address I didn't recognize across town. The pre-approval amount was $950,000. I kept digging and found a real estate listing printed out. A beautiful 4-bedroom house with a pool, granite countertops, and a 3-car garage. Jessica had written notes on it. Perfect and dream house. Then I found the calculations. Scribbled on a notepad in Daniel's handwriting were numbers that made everything horrifyingly clear. Mom's house sale, $680,000. Minus realtor fees, $640,000. Current mortgage owed, $0. Net profit, $640,000. Plus our savings, $85,000. Total, $725. Down payment on new house, $190,000. Leaves $535,000 for renovations and reserves. I felt dizzy. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. This wasn't about needing space for a baby. This wasn't about me being too old to manage a house. This was about money. Pure, cold greed. They wanted me gone so they could sell my house, pocket over $500,000 in profit, and use it to upgrade their lifestyle. I was nothing but a financial obstacle standing between them and their dream home with a pool. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to take several shots to get clear images. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. They couldn't know that I knew. Not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to protect myself from my own son's betrayal. I made it back to my bedroom before the tears came. They poured out of me in waves, silent sobs that shook my entire body as I collapsed onto my bed. I pressed my face into my pillow to muffle the sounds, not wanting them to somehow hear me even though they were at work. The pain was physical, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. This was worse than losing James. At least his death wasn't a choice. At least he loved me until his last breath. But this was my own son choosing money over his mother. I pulled myself off the bed and sank to the floor, reaching under it to drag out the old cardboard boxes I kept there. Photo albums, dozens of them, chronicling Daniel's entire life. With trembling hands, I opened the first one. There he was, a tiny newborn with a shock of dark hair, wrapped in the blue blanket my mother had knitted. I remembered that day so clearly. The overwhelming love I felt the first time I held him, the promise I made to myself that I would give him everything, be everything he needed. I turned the pages through blurry eyes. Daniel at 6 months grinning toothlessly at the camera. Daniel taking his first steps in our tiny apartment, arms outstretched toward James. Daniel on his first day of kindergarten, wearing the shirt I'd stayed up until midnight sewing because we couldn't afford the one he wanted from the store. Each photo was a memory, a sacrifice, a piece of my heart that I'd freely given. There was Daniel at his 8th birthday party, the one where I'd worked triple shifts for 2 months to afford the bicycle he'd been begging for. He'd cried with joy when he saw it, thrown his arms around my neck, and said, "You're the best mom in the whole world." I touched the photo with my finger, tracing the outline of his young, innocent face. Where did that little boy go? When did he become someone who could calculate my worth in dollar signs? I pulled out more albums. Daniel's high school graduation, standing between James's grave marker and me because his father hadn't lived to see that day. Daniel's college acceptance letter that I'd paid for with money I earned scrubbing floors. Daniel's wedding day, where I'd walked him down the aisle because there was no father to do it, and I'd held back tears of joy thinking about how proud James would have been. Every milestone, every achievement, every happy moment had been built on my sacrifices. The meals I skipped, the winters I shivered in a thin coat, the dreams I abandoned, the youth I surrendered, the loneliness I endured, all of it for him. And this was my reward, to be discarded like garbage so he could have a house with a pool? I looked at my reflection in the dresser mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had I become so old? When had the lines around my eyes deepened so much? When had my hair turned completely gray? I'd given my entire life to being Daniel's mother, and somewhere along the way I'd forgotten to be Margaret. I'd erased myself for him, and now he was erasing me from his life. The sobs came harder, deeper, until I thought I might break apart completely. But somewhere in that darkness, in that pit of despair and betrayal, a tiny spark of anger began to glow. I woke up the next morning with swollen, puffy eyes and a pounding headache. But something inside me had fundamentally changed. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror as I splashed cold water on my face, and for the first time in days, I didn't see a helpless victim staring back. I saw a survivor. I saw a woman who'd overcome poverty, widowhood, and decades of struggle. I saw someone who'd built a life from absolutely nothing. And that woman was not going to roll over and let her own son steal everything she'd worked for. As I patted my face dry with a towel, clarity washed over me like a revelation. I'd spent the entire night crying, mourning, grieving the son I thought I had. But grief was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. I needed to think strategically. I needed to protect myself. Daniel and Jessica had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. They had strategies, documents, and calculations. They thought they were dealing with a naive old woman who would simply accept whatever they decided. They were wrong. I stood up straighter, rolling my shoulders back. My reflection looked different now, determined, almost fierce. Yes, I was 68 years old. Yes, I'd spent my life being soft, accommodating, putting everyone else's needs before my own. But I was also the woman who'd survived losing her husband at 39. I was the woman who'd worked 2 jobs and 4 hours of sleep to raise a child alone. I was the woman who'd built this house with her own savings, her own sweat, her own determination. James hadn't died working himself into an early grave just so his widow could be manipulated and discarded by the very son we'd sacrificed everything for. That thought ignited something fierce in my chest. I could almost feel James beside me, telling me to fight, to stand up, to protect what was ours. I walked to my closet and pulled out a small wooden box from the top shelf, the one where I kept important documents. Inside were the original property deed, purchase agreements, mortgage payment records going back 33 years, tax statements, receipts for every major repair and renovation I'd paid for. Everything was meticulously organized because that's who I was. I'd kept records of everything. As I spread the documents across my bed, I began to see the full picture of my position. Yes, Daniel's name was on the deed as a co-owner, but I was the original purchaser. I had proof of every single payment made on this house. I had decades of documentation showing this was my home, my investment, my life's work. I wasn't as powerless as they thought. I made a decision right then. I wasn't going to confront them with tears and pleas. I wasn't going to beg my son to love me or value me. If they wanted to play games with lawyers and property laws, then I would play too. But I would play smarter. I would be strategic, patient, and prepared. They'd underestimated me because I'd always been the gentle, giving mother. They'd forgotten that gentle people can have steel spines when pushed too far. I picked up my phone with steady hands. It was time to make some calls. It was time to fight back. My first call was to Robert Chen, my late husband's closest friend and a real estate attorney who'd been practicing law for over 30 years. Robert and James had served in the Navy together, and he'd been at our wedding, at Daniel's baptism, at James's funeral. If anyone would help me navigate this nightmare, it was him. Margaret. His warm voice came through the phone. What a pleasant surprise. How are you? Robert, I need your help, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need a lawyer, and I need someone I can trust. We met at his office the next afternoon while Daniel and Jessica were at work. I brought every document I owned and the photos I'd taken of their secret paperwork. Robert listened intently as I explained everything, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. Margaret, I'm going to be honest with you. What they're planning is morally reprehensible, but legally complicated because Daniel's name is on the deed. He paused, studying the documents. However, you have significant protections. You're the original owner. You've paid every expense for over 30 years. We can demonstrate that Daniel's co-ownership was a gift for estate planning purposes, not an actual transfer of control. Over the next 2 hours, Robert helped me craft a multi-layered protection strategy. First, we drafted a document removing Daniel as co-owner, citing that the original addition was conditional upon certain family circumstances that were no longer being met. Second, we prepared a new deed transferring the property into a living trust with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary during my lifetime. Third, and this was the part that made me feel both powerful and heartbroken, we designated that upon my death, the house would be donated to a local charity supporting homeless, elderly women, rather than passing to Daniel. Are you sure about this last part? Robert asked gently. Once this is executed, Daniel gets nothing. I'm sure, I said, though my voice cracked slightly. If he wants to, treat me like a financial asset rather than his mother, then he can learn what it feels like to lose everything. But I wasn't done. Robert helped me set up a separate bank account and transferred my pension and savings into it, ensuring Daniel couldn't access any of my funds. I purchased a small recording device and downloaded an app on my phone that would record conversations. If they confronted me again, I'd have evidence of their intentions. Next, I called my friend Helen, who worked as a producer for the local news station. I didn't tell her everything, just asked hypothetically if they'd be interested in a story about elder financial abuse. "Are you kidding?" she said. "That's exactly the kind of human interest piece we love. Why? Do you know someone?" I told her maybe, and to keep her calendar open. Finally, I rented a safety deposit box at a bank across town and stored copies of everything there: documents, recordings, photos, evidence. If this went to court, I'd be ready. I spent an entire week quietly executing this plan, moving like a chess player setting up pieces on a board. Daniel and Jessica had no idea that the helpless old woman they were plotting against had become their worst nightmare. I was armed, protected, and absolutely done being a victim. 4 days after putting all my protections in place, Daniel and Jessica asked me to sit down for another talk. This time, they'd clearly decided to be more aggressive. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they cornered me in the living room with printed materials spread across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "Mom, we found some really nice places for you," Jessica said with forced cheerfulness, pushing glossy brochures toward me. "This one is only 20 minutes away, and look, they have activities, a library, even a garden where you could grow your tomatoes." My heart pounded, but I kept my face calm. My phone was in my cardigan pocket, already recording. Every word they said was being captured, preserved as evidence. "We've already talked to a realtor about listing the house," Daniel added, unable to meet my eyes. "Mark Simpson. He specializes in this neighborhood and thinks we could get a great price. We can help you move next month. We'll even pay for the movers." I nodded slowly, letting them think I was considering it. "And what happens to the house after I leave?" I asked, my voice quiet and controlled. Jessica and Daniel exchanged a quick glance. "We'll handle everything," Daniel said. "You don't need to worry about any of it." "Will you sell it?" I pressed, looking directly at my son. There was a pause. Jessica's jaw tightened. "Eventually, yes," she admitted. "We need something bigger. Something that fits our growing family better." The lies tasted bitter in the air between us. I stood up slowly, walked to my bedroom, and returned carrying a folder I'd prepared. "Before I agree to anything," I said, placing it on the table with deliberate care, "I think you both should see these." I opened the folder to reveal the property documents clearly showing I was the original and primary owner. Then I laid out the photos I'd taken of their mortgage pre-approval letters, their calculations, their plans for the dream house with the pool. The color drained from their faces. "You went through our private papers?" Daniel stammered, his voice rising. "You went through my entire life," I replied, my voice ice cold. "You calculated exactly how much my home was worth to you. You researched how to manipulate me into leaving. You treated me like a business transaction instead of your mother." The tension in the room was suffocating. Jessica's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. Daniel looked between the documents and me, panic spreading across his features. This was the moment everything would change. "You know what?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "I'm going to make this very easy for both of you." I walked to my bedroom and returned with 2 suitcases I'd already packed days ago. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion and relief, like they couldn't believe I was surrendering so easily. "Mom, wait," Daniel started, but I held up my hand. "No, you wanted me gone, so I'm leaving." Then I reached into my folder and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it firmly in Daniel's hands. "But first, open this." His fingers trembled as he tore open the seal. Jessica leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the document inside. I watched their faces transform from confusion to shock to absolute horror. "What is this?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "That," I said clearly, "is the official documentation showing that I've removed Daniel's name from the property deed entirely. I filed it with the county recorder's office 3 days ago. This house is now solely in my name again." "You can't do that," Jessica shouted, her composure finally cracking. "Actually, I can. My lawyer confirmed it. Daniel's co-ownership was a gift, added for estate planning purposes. Since you've both made it clear you view this property as a financial asset to liquidate rather than a family home, I've revoked that gift." Daniel's face had gone completely white. "Mom, please, we can talk about this." "We're done talking," I continued, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I've also transferred the title into a living trust. When I die, this house will be donated to a homeless shelter for elderly women who've been abandoned by their families. You won't see a single penny." Jessica's face turned crimson. "You're being ridiculous. Daniel is your son. You can't just cut him out." "And I was his mother," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. But apparently that meant nothing when compared to $680,000. I picked up my suitcases and walked toward the door. "Enjoy the house," I said without looking back. "I'll be sending movers for my remaining belongings." As I walked out into the afternoon sunlight, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: free. But here's what they didn't know. I hadn't actually left town. I'd rented a beautiful 2-bedroom condo just 3 blocks away, using money I'd been secretly saving. From my new living room window, I could see my old house perfectly. And I planned to watch everything unfold. 7 days. That's how long it took for them to realize what they'd lost. From my condo window, I watched the chaos unfold at my old house like a silent movie. I saw Daniel pacing in the yard, phone pressed to his ear, probably calling lawyers. I saw Jessica's car leave early and return late, the stress visible even from a distance. I saw lights on at all hours, imagining the arguments happening inside those walls. On the 8th day, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw them standing there, Daniel and Jessica, looking exhausted and desperate. Daniel's eyes were red and puffy. Jessica looked like she hadn't slept in days. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and opened the door. "Mom," Daniel's voice broke immediately. "Please, we need to talk. We made a terrible mistake." I let them in without a word. As they entered my condo, they froze, taking in the sight before them. My small space was beautifully decorated with all my belongings perfectly arranged. My plants thrived on the sunny balcony. My photos lined the walls. But what stopped them cold was what covered my dining table: applications to volunteer organizations, travel brochures for Italy and Ireland, a part-time job offer letter from the local bookstore, and a registration form for painting classes at the community college. This wasn't temporary. This was a new life, carefully built and thriving without them. "You're not coming back," Jessica whispered, the realization hitting her. "Why would I?" I asked simply. "I spent 40 years sacrificing everything for family. Now I'm going to spend whatever time I have left living for myself." Daniel collapsed onto my couch, sobbing. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Jessica's mother kept telling us we were fools not to cash in on the property value, that you'd be fine in a smaller place. We got greedy. We got stupid. Please forgive me." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw genuine remorse. But I also saw the lesson he needed to learn. "Daniel, forgiveness isn't the same as trust. You showed me that when times got tough, when money was involved, I became disposable to you." Over the following months, Daniel worked hard to prove he'd changed. He attended therapy, cut off contact with Jessica's toxic mother, and showed up consistently, not asking for anything, just trying to rebuild what he'd destroyed. I eventually forgave him, but I never added his name back to any property documents. Some wounds heal, but they leave scars that remind you of valuable lessons learned. As I sit here today in my cozy condo, sipping chamomile tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I've learned something profound about life, family, and self-worth. My small balcony garden is flourishing. The tomatoes are ripe, the herbs are fragrant, and the roses bloom brighter than they ever did in my old yard. Maybe it's because I'm finally tending to them for myself, not to prove my worth to anyone else. I thought for so many years that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything, even my dignity, even my peace, even my home. I thought love meant erasing yourself so others could thrive. But real love, true family love, doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't calculate your value in dollar signs. It doesn't research ways to remove you like an inconvenient obstacle. My relationship with Daniel will never be what it was. That innocent trust, that unconditional faith I had in him, died the day he handed me those senior living brochures. But we're rebuilding something new, something more honest. He visits every Sunday now, not because he wants something, but because he finally understands what he almost lost forever. Jessica apologized too, though our relationship remains cordial at best. I accepted her words, but I'll never forget how easily she viewed me as disposable. I've started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helps elderly people facing housing discrimination and family exploitation. My story isn't unique. Every week I meet seniors whose children, the very people they sacrificed everything for, have tried to manipulate them out of their homes, their savings, their dignity. I share my story and I teach them to fight back, to document everything, to never be ashamed of protecting themselves. The greatest lesson I learned is this: it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to walk away from people who don't value you, even if they're family, especially if they're family. Moral of the story: greed destroys what love builds. Never take for granted the people who sacrificed everything for you, because one day you might turn around and realize the only thing you truly lost wasn't property or money, but something irreplaceable: unconditional love and trust that can never be fully restored. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have forgiven Daniel, or would you have cut ties completely? Have you ever experienced something similar with your own family? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same pain. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's struggling with family issues, or someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about resilience, justice, and the courage it takes to choose yourself when the world expects you to sacrifice everything. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are never too old, never too late, and never too weak to reclaim your dignity and demand the respect you deserve. Until next time, take care of yourselves and never forget your worth.